A gardener was humiliated by his boss in front of his 9-year-old son. Upon seeing what was happening, the gardener's son revealed a secret about the boss that made him tremble. The afternoon sun scorched the vast gardens of the Sinclair mansion, where James Thorne, a man in his early 40s with worry lines etched into his sun-tanned face, was meticulously trimming the ornamental bushes. His son Finn, a slender 9-year-old boy with freckles on his nose and curious eyes, was playing quietly nearby, occasionally glancing anxiously at his father. The silence was abruptly shattered by the piercing sound of glass breaking. "Dad, I didn't mean to. It was an accident," Finn shouted, his face pale with fear, as he stared at the shards of a greenhouse filled with rare orchids at his feet. James dropped his tools and rushed towards his son, his heart racing. "Finn, what happened? Are you hurt?" Before James could reach Finn, Mr. Everett's thunderous voice echoed through the garden. The owner, a burly man in an impeccable suit with a face red with fury, marched towards them. "Thorne, what the hell is going on here? What did your son do?" he demanded, furious. James instinctively positioned himself between Mr. Everett and his son. "Mr. Everett, it was an accident. Finn didn't mean to," he began, but his boss had no patience for explanations. "Silence. Those orchids were unique specimens, imported from Southeast Asia." "They're worth more than you make in a year, Thorne," he interrupted, his eyes blazing with anger. James's face turned pale and his hands trembled as he approached his boss. "Mr. Everett, please, I will pay for the damages. I will work extra hours, anything," the gardener pleaded in defense of his son. However, his boss cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Enough with the excuses, Thorne. First the poorly trimmed rose bushes, and now this. You're fired. I don't want either of you here anymore. Gather your things and get off my family's property," he thundered. Finn, realizing the seriousness of the situation, clung to his father's leg, sobbing. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble." James hugged his son, trying to comfort him as his own world fell apart. "Mr. Everett, I beg you, reconsider. My family and my daughter is sick. We desperately need this job." However, the boss, his gaze shifting between the shattered glass and the desolate pair before him, hardened his expression and said, "That is not my problem, Thorne. You are incompetent, and I no longer want you working for me." Finn, seeing the embarrassment on his father's face through his flushed cheeks, gathered all his courage. Taking a step forward, he shouted with all the strength in his lungs, "Please don't do this. My sister will die without treatment. You always do this. You always treat people like this. I saw what you did to the driver last week." His words echoed through the gardens, laden with an anguish that seemed too heavy for his small body to bear. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Everett paled at the secret almost revealed by the boy, and glanced toward the windows, making sure no one had heard what the boy said. Then he stormed toward the child, not caring who was watching. James pulled his son close, his voice choked as he murmured, "My God, Finn, Mr. Everett, I will do anything. Please give me one more chance. My family depends on this. We need this." The boss stopped, turning slowly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the father and son, the weight of his decision hanging in the tense air of the garden. "My answer is no. Get out of here." "Aunt James, teach your son to keep his mouth shut or I'll take care of it myself," he responded, unyielding. A few blocks from the mansion, the hospital room pulsed with the steady rhythm of heart monitors, the air heavy with the scent of antiseptic and worry. Laurel Thorne, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and disheveled hair, held tightly to her daughter Willow's frail hand. The 5-year-old girl, pale and weak, looked tiny in the hospital bed. Laurel watched every movement of her daughter, every shallow breath, fearing that at any moment it could be the last. "Mum, when are Dad and Finn coming to see me? I really wanted to play with Finn. It feels like I haven't played with him in forever. I miss my little brother," Willow whispered, her voice barely audible. Laurel swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Soon, sweetheart. They're coming, as soon as they can. Your dad is working and took your brother with him, but they'll come as soon as they can to see you, okay? Rest now, all right? Don't worry. They miss you too and will be here soon." The door to the room opened and the doctor entered, his face serious as he flipped through a clipboard. Laurel stood up instinctively, her heart racing with the anticipation of bad news. The doctor cleared his throat, looking from Laurel to Willow, before speaking in a low voice. "Mistress Thorne, can we speak outside for a moment?" he asked, indicating the hallway. Laurel hesitated, looking at Willow. "Mummy will be right back. Okay, my love? I'm going to talk to the doctor, and then I will come back to stay with you," Laurel said to her daughter, before following the doctor out of the room. In the hallway, Dr. Michaels wasted no time with pleasantries. "Mistress Thorne, Willow's condition is deteriorating faster than we expected, without the treatment we discussed earlier. I'm afraid she only has a few days," he said carefully, choosing his words with all the empathy he could to deliver the news to the girl's mother. Laurel felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Days, but you said we had weeks to start the treatment. How is this possible?" she asked, desperate for any chance to save her daughter. Dr. Michaels placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I am very sorry. The disease is progressing aggressively. The treatment is our best hope right now." Back in the room, Laurel sat next to Willow, her mind spinning with the numbers Dr. Michaels had mentioned earlier. The cost of the treatment was astronomical, far beyond anything they could afford with their jobs as a gardener and a house cleaner. She looked at her daughter, so small and fragile, struggling for every breath. "Mommy, why are you crying? I don't like seeing you sad. It makes me worried." "What is going on?" Willow asked, her big eyes full of concern. Laurel quickly wiped away her tears. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Mommy is just a little tired, that's all." Laurel's phone vibrated in her pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out, seeing James's name on the screen. With a last glance at Willow, she answered, whispering a quick, "Hi, honey." "How was work today?" she asked, not knowing how to bring up what the doctor had said about their daughter's treatment. Before she could tell him, James's voice trembled on the other end of the line, filled with emotion and fear. "Laurel, I was fired. Mr. Everett fired me today," he said, making Laurel's world seem to slow down, the sound of Willow's heart monitor echoing in her ears like a dark omen. Laurel felt the weight of the world collapse on her shoulders. With a choked voice, she shared the devastating news about Willow. "James, the doctor, he said that Willow only has a few days without the treatment. It costs far more than we can afford," she said. There was a prolonged silence on the line, broken only by James's heavy breathing. Finally he spoke, his voice determined despite the tremor. "I'm going back to the mansion. I will beg Mr. Everett, or maybe even his father, Mr. Sinclair. They have to understand we cannot lose our little girl," the gardener responded, feeling the weight of saving his daughter. He would do everything he could to keep Willow alive. James hung up the phone, his face a mask of desperate determination. He turned to Finn, who was watching him with wide, scared eyes. "Son, we need to go back to the mansion. Your sister needs us now more than ever." Finn nodded silently, taking his father's hand. Together they walked back to the imposing Sinclair estate, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Father, what if Mr. Sinclair doesn't listen to us?" Finn asked, his voice trembling. James squeezed his son's hand. "He has to listen, Finn. For Willow." As they approached the mansion, they saw Mr. Everett in the garden supervising some workers. James took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked over, Finn clinging to his side. "Sir, please, I need to talk to you about my daughter," he called out, his voice shaky but determined. The former boss turned, his face hardening as he saw James and Finn. "Thorne, I thought I made it clear that you are fired. What are you doing here, and bringing your son to beg?" he said, his voice cold. James felt the sting of the words, but did not back down. He dropped to his knees, pulling Finn down with him. "Mr. Sinclair, I beg you. My daughter is dying. She needs treatment that we cannot afford. Please reconsider my dismissal. I need one chance to save my daughter. I will do anything." His words came out broken by sobs. Finn, with tears in his eyes, clung to his father's arm. "Father, no," Finn whispered, embarrassed and scared to see his father beg. "Shh, son, sometimes we have to swallow our pride for the family," James whispered back. Sinclair looked down at the pair kneeling in front of him, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "Look at the two of you. Pathetic. Is this what you teach your son, Thorne? To grovel like a worm?" He stepped closer, circling them like a predator. "Stand up. I want everyone to see how low you have fallen." James and Finn slowly rose, trembling and humiliated. Mr. Sinclair, please, I don't mind lowering myself if it's for my daughter's life. James started, but he was cut off by a hard slap across the face. Shut up. You are an incompetent fool who doesn't deserve mercy. And now you want me to save your daughter? Sinclair roared. Finn, unable to hold back, shouted, Stop. Don't hurt my father, he pleaded. Sinclair turned his attention to the boy, his eyes blazing with anger. He let go of James and grabbed Finn by the arm, pulling him away from James. You insolent brat. I'll teach you both a lesson about respect. The sound of footsteps on the gravel made everyone turn. There, standing with a look of shock and horror, was Mr. Ambrose Sinclair, Everett's elderly father, the owner of the estate. His eyes took in the scene. His son holding Finn roughly by the arm, James with the red mark of slap on his face, both of them looking terrified and desperate. The old man opened his mouth, but no sound came out, the air heavy with the tension of the moment frozen in time. The silence that followed Mr. Ambrose's arrival was broken by Finn's desperate scream. The boy, his face red with fear and indignation, pointed a trembling finger at Everett Sinclair. I saw what you did to the old driver. You hurt him and threatened him, just like you're doing to my father, he said with conviction. The words echoed through the garden, heavy and accusatory. Everett Sinclair's face, once flushed with anger, visibly paled, his eyes widening in shock and panic. What is this boy talking about, Everett? Said Mr. Ambrose, his voice cutting through the air, firm and demanding. His eyes, once filled with horror at the scene he had witnessed, now gleamed with a mix of confusion and suspicion over what the gardener's son had said. Everett stammered, trying to regain his composure. Father, this is absurd. It's obvious the boy is lying to protect his father's job, Everett tried to argue. James, still bearing the mark of the slap on his face, attempted to calm the situation. Finn, son, please don't say anything more. We just came to ask for my job back, remember? Let's leave this alone. The most important thing is your sister's health, he pleaded, but his words fell on deaf ears. Finn, driven by the courage and innocence of a child, seeing the weight of the injustice against his father, continued. I saw everything from the attic window. Mr. Everett was yelling at the driver. He pushed him against the car and said horrible things to him, mocking him for being poor. He even said the driver would never work in this town again, the boy said, his voice trembling but filled with courage. Everett, recovering from the initial shock, let out a forced laugh. Well, look at that. What an overactive imagination this boy has. Father, you're not going to believe a child's fantasies, are you? He asked in a disdainful tone, as if the boy's story didn't matter. Then he took a threatening step towards Finn, his fists clenched at his sides. You little liar. I'm going to teach you to keep that mouth shut, he said, advancing on the child. James, seeing the imminent threat to his son, acted on instinct. In one quick motion he pushed Finn behind him, standing firmly between his son and the enraged Mr. Sinclair. Don't you dare touch my son. He's just a child. If you want to do something to someone, do it to me. Don't you dare harm him in front of me, James shouted, his voice trembling with adrenaline and protective instinct. Everett stopped inches from James, his hot, heavy breath against the gardener's face. Get out of my way. This is none of your business. That boy needs discipline. Mr. Ambrose looked from Everett to Finn and James, his expression a mix of doubt and concern. The garden, once a place of peace, now felt like a minefield of accusations and secrets. The air was thick with tension, each breath seeming to weigh a ton. Everett, leave the boy alone. Mr. Ambrose began slowly. If what he says is a lie, why are you reacting with such violence? Everett paled again, his mask of calm threatening to crumble. I just felt insulted by the accusation, Father. You know how much I value my reputation. Mr. Ambrose Sinclair raised his hand, silencing his son with a firm gesture. His eyes, tired but sharp, turned to Finn. Young man, I want you to tell me everything you saw. Don't be afraid. No one will hurt you in my presence. Everett opened his mouth to protest, but a stern look from his father made him back down. James, still standing protectively in front of Finn, hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, allowing his son to speak. It will be all right, Finn. Tell the truth, just as I have always taught you to do, my son. You can speak. We will not let anything happen to you, James murmured, his voice trembling but encouraging. Finn swallowed hard, nervously glancing between his father and Mr. Ambrose before starting to speak. The boy began hesitantly, but soon the words flowed like a torrent. It wasn't just the driver. I saw Mr. Everett yelling at the cook last week, saying he was going to fire her if she complained again about the unpaid overtime. Finn paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. And there was that time with the cleaning lady. Mr. Everett threatened to have her deported if she didn't work while sick. She started working and spent the whole day working and crying in pain. She could barely hold a bucket and almost fell down the stairs. "You little liar," Everett growled, taking a threatening step toward Finn, but Mr. Ambrose stopped him with a sharp look. "Continue, Finn," the elder Sinclair encouraged, his voice gentle but firm. Finn, encouraged by Mr. Ambrose's attention, continued his account. "There's more, Mr. Sinclair. I heard Mr. Everett on the phone, arranging with someone to falsify the workers' time records. He was laughing, saying no one would find out." Everett's face grew paler with every word Finn spoke, his gaze shifting between fury and panic. "This is ridiculous. Father, you can't believe these absurd stories from a boy." Everett exploded. Mr. Ambrose raised his hand again, silencing his son. "Everett, these accusations are too serious to ignore. I cannot believe you would treat them this way behind my back." The air in the garden grew even heavier, laden with the weight of Finn's revelations. James looked at his son with a mixture of pride and fear, fully aware of the potential repercussions. Everett Sinclair resembled a cornered animal, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for an escape. Mr. Ambrose remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a deep disappointment. "Mr. Ambrose, I swear I knew nothing about this. Finn never told me that all this was happening to the others. I spend most of my working hours in the garden, outside the house. I had no idea my son was witnessing these things when he came to accompany me to work. This doesn't happen often, only when he can't go to school. I wonder what else he saw when I wasn't around," James said, his voice low and urgent. Suddenly the conversation was interrupted by the shrill ring of a cell phone. James, startled, grabbed the phone with trembling hands. His face paled when he saw the hospital's name on the screen. With his heart racing, he answered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Hello? Yes, this is me. Has something happened to my daughter?" he asked, his voice choked with worry. The seconds seemed to drag as he listened, his face twisting into a mask of pure terror. No, 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 this can't be happening. Not to my little girl. My God, please don't let this be true," James murmured, tears beginning to roll down his face. Finn, sensing the change in his father, grabbed his hand. "Father, what is it? Is it Willow?" James hung up the phone, his eyes meeting Finn's, full of fear and worry. "Willow, she collapsed. We need to get to the hospital in the city now. She needs immediate surgery." His words came out broken, filled with desperation. The world around them seemed to vanish, the dispute with the Sinclairs momentarily forgotten in the face of Willow's urgent situation. "My God, how are we going to pay so we don't lose Willow, Father? Don't lie to me. You always say everything will be all right and that I shouldn't worry, but that's far from the truth this time." "Please, Father, don't let me lose my little sister," Finn sobbed, clinging to his father. James looked helplessly at the Sinclairs, the despair evident in every line of his face. We have to go, Finn." Minutes later, the hospital corridor echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps and tense voices. James and Finn rushed through the pediatric wing, their hearts pounding in their chests. Laurel met them at Willow's door, her face pale and streaked with tears. Before they could exchange words, the doctor emerged from the room, his grave expression signaling the urgency of the situation. "Mr. and Mistress Thorne, we need to talk immediately," the doctor said, guiding them to a private room. James gripped Laurel's hand tightly, feeling it tremble. "Doctor, please, tell us what's happening to our daughter." The doctor took a deep breath, his eyes reflecting a mixture of compassion and professional concern. "Willow's condition has deteriorated rapidly. She needs the procedure immediately. It's our only option at this point, but I must warn you, it's extremely expensive and not covered by insurance. We don't have time to wait any longer. I need you to pay immediately to proceed with her treatment," he said, his words hanging in the air, heavy as lead. James and Laurel exchanged looks of pure despair, while Finn, standing near the door, stifled a sob. "How much? Tell me, I will do anything to make this right." My little girl deserves to live. She deserves it. She's not at fault for having poor parents. She needs a chance, and I will do everything I can to give her that chance," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated before responding. "The procedure costs $500,000, sir. I know it's an exorbitant amount, but it's Willow's only chance. I need you to authorize this immediately. She's already going into crisis, and this is the only way to save her." The silence that followed was deafening. Laurel covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James stood still, his face a mask of shock and despair. Finn moved closer, hugging his mother, his own tears mingling with hers. "We don't have that kind of money. How can we let our daughter die? How am I going to get all of that?" James finally spoke, his voice breaking. Laurel looked up, her red eyes glowing with fierce determination. "We won't. We'll sell the furniture, sell everything we own, but it won't be enough. We have to think of another way. What are we going to do?" The doctor watched them with empathy. "I understand. This is a huge shock. Unfortunately, we don't have much time, and I'm afraid selling something won't give you time to start the treatment. Willow needs the procedure now to have a chance. I'll give you a few minutes to talk. Please let me know as soon as you make a decision. But I suggest you say your goodbyes to your daughter," he said, letting the implications of his words sink in. As soon as the doctor left, the Thorne family embraced, united in their despair and fear. Tears flowed freely, words of comfort mixed with impossible promises. James pulled away first, wiping his tired face with his hand. "I'm going to call everyone we know. Someone has to be able to help us," he said, his voice trembling but determined. Laurel nodded, squeezing Finn's hand. "I'll talk to the bank. Maybe we can get an emergency loan," she said. But both of them knew it was a futile effort. It was far too much money, an amount they had never had access to, nor did their friends or family. While James frantically dialed on his cell phone, and Laurel spoke quickly on the phone with the bank manager, Finn remained seated, his eyes closed, as if praying, hoping for a miracle at any moment. Time seemed to drag on, each minute an eternity of hope and fear. "No one can lend us that much money," James muttered, hanging up the phone for the 10th time. Laurel shook her head, the tears starting to fall again. "The bank said there's no way to approve a loan that size for people with a low income like ours," she said. Meanwhile, Finn continued his prayer fervently, with unwavering faith in the face of the crisis. Suddenly, the door to the room opened. They all turned, expecting to see the doctor with more grim news. Instead, to everyone's shock, Mr. Ambrose Sinclair entered, his face a mix of concern and determination. "I overheard you and your son when you rushed out of the mansion, saying you needed help for your daughter's treatment, which was to begin at this hospital," he said, his grave voice breaking the stunned silence. James stood up, confused. "Mr. Sinclair, how? Why?" Mr. Ambrose stepped forward, his eyes scanning the desperate faces of the Thorne family. "I'm here to offer my help. I can pay for Willow's procedure." A collective sigh of relief and disbelief filled the room. But before their gratitude could fully manifest, Mr. Ambrose raised his hand, his face growing serious. "However, there is one condition." Mr. Ambrose Sinclair stepped closer to the Thorne family, his gaze compassionate yet determined. "James, I'm willing to pay for Willow's treatment in full. In return, I want you to come back and work for me for 1 year," he began, his voice calm but firm. James blinked, confused, while Laurel gripped his hand tightly. Mr. Ambrose continued, "Not for my son, but for me. I need someone I can trust to help me." "Work? For you?" James stammered, his mind reeling from the implications of the offer. Laurel intervened, her voice trembling but hopeful. "James, this could save our Willow," Mr. Ambrose nodded gravely. "Yes, James. Your son Finn revealed serious problems in the management of the mansion, and I believe the same issues exist in my company, where I left my son in charge. I need someone honest, someone who understands what it is to be an employee, to fix the mistakes my son has made. Someone like you." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "You will have the authority to make changes, to correct the injustices your son witnessed, and most importantly, your daughter will receive the treatment she needs." James looked at Laurel, then at Finn, who was watching the scene with wide, anxious eyes. He turned back to Mr. Ambrose, his voice low and intense. "And what about your son? Won't he try to interfere? Will he try to hurt my son again? Mr. Ambrose sighed heavily. Everett will be removed from all management roles. His actions have consequences, James. This is my way of starting to right the wrongs I allowed to happen behind my back. I assure you, your son will be safe when he is at work. You won't have to worry about his safety while he is there, he said. At that moment, a shrill alarm pierced the air, making everyone jump. The monitors in Willow's room began beeping frantically. Panic spread across everyone's faces in the room. James and Laurel rushed to the door, with Finn close behind. The doctor and a team of nurses were already entering Willow's room. James tried to follow them, but a nurse blocked his way. Please, sir, let us work, she said firmly, closing the door. Laurel clung to James, sobbing. Our girl, James. Our girl. The hallway filled with frantic activity, with doctors and nurses rushing in and out of the room. James, Laurel, and Finn stood pressed against the wall, helpless and terrified. Mr. Ambrose stood a little farther away, his face a mask of worry and guilt. James turned to Mr. Ambrose, his eyes filled with tears and desperation. Please save my daughter. I will do anything. I will work at anything you ask. I just need my children to live, he pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Ambrose nodded solemnly, already pulling out his phone. Consider it done, James. I am making the transfer right now. As Mr. Ambrose spoke quickly into the phone, arranging the payment, the doctor emerged from Willow's room. His face was serious but determined. Mr. and Mistress Thorne, we need to start the procedure immediately. We don't have a minute to lose. James looked at Laurel, then at Finn, and finally at Mr. Ambrose. In that moment, all doubts and hesitations disappeared. There was only one choice to make. Mr. Ambrose Sinclair quickly grabbed his phone, his fingers moving urgently over the screen. Doctor, this is Ambrose Sinclair. I am making the transfer to cover all the costs for Willow Thorne's treatment right now. Please start the procedure immediately, he ordered, his voice firm and authoritative. The doctor looked surprised, but quickly nodded, returning to Willow's room. James and Laurel stood speechless, the gratitude and relief clear on their faces. Mr. Sinclair, we don't know how to thank you, Laurel stammered through her tears. There's no need for thanks right now. The important thing is saving your daughter, Mr. Ambrose replied. His eyes focused on the phone screen as he completed the transfer. The hospital hallway became a whirlwind of activity. Nurses and doctors rushed in and out of Willow's room, carrying equipment and speaking in urgent but controlled voices. James and Laurel remained leaning against the wall, holding each other, with Finn between them. All three watched the scene with a mix of fear and hope. Minutes later, the doors to the surgery room closed with a dull thud, leaving the Thorne family and Mr. Ambrose Sinclair in a silence heavy with anxiety. James held Laurel's hand tightly, both of them staring at the closed doors as if they could see through them. Finn placed his hands together in prayer, his eyes red from crying. The hospital hallway, once a hub of activity, now seemed eerily quiet, punctuated only by the occasional muffled sound of hurried footsteps and the distant hum of medical equipment. How long will it take? Will we get news soon? I can't stand waiting. I just want to know my little sister will be all right, Finn asked after a few minutes, his small, frightened voice breaking the silence. Laurel turned to her son, forcing a comforting smile. It may take a few hours, sweetheart. Surgeries sometimes take time, but now our Willow has a chance to live. Let's keep praying, just like we do every day. This time, let's pray that everything goes well in the operating room, okay? She said, trying to calm her son despite her own nervousness. The hours dragged on as if they were days. James paced back and forth in the hallway, occasionally stopping to glance at the clock on the wall, only to resume pacing with renewed agitation. Laurel alternated between sitting next to Finn, whispering words of comfort, and joining James in his silent vigil in front of the surgery room doors. Mr. Ambrose remained in a corner, a quiet but constant presence, his face a mask of worry and guilt. What if it doesn't work? What if we got help too late? This is all my fault. I should have had a better job, should have done more, James murmured, almost to himself, his voice trembling with fear. Laurel moved closer, wrapping him in a tight embrace. We can't think like that. Willow is strong, and the doctors are doing everything they can. She's gonna make it. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to weigh on everyone. Finn finally fell asleep, uncomfortably curled up in the plastic chair. Laurel sat beside him, gently stroking his hair, her own eyes struggling to stay open. James continued his tireless vigil, refusing to sit or rest, as if his state of alertness could somehow influence the outcome of the surgery. "James, you need to rest a little," Laurel pleaded, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. He shook his head stubbornly. "I can't. Not until I know she's okay." Suddenly, the doors to the operating room opened. The doctor emerged, still dressed in his surgical gown, his face tired and his expression unreadable. James's heart seemed to stop for a moment, and Laurel stood up abruptly, waking Finn in the process. The doctor approached slowly, his eyes scanning the anxious faces in front of him. "Mr. and Mistress Thorne, the surgery is over. Would you like to follow me for a private conversation?" he began, his voice serious and controlled. James swallowed hard, feeling the blood drain from his face. "Doctor, please, just tell us." The doctor raised a hand, gently interrupting. "I prefer to discuss the details in private, if you don't mind." He cast a meaningful glance at Finn, who was now fully awake, his eyes wide with fear and anticipation. James and Laurel exchanged a quick glance, a mix of terror and hope passing between them. Nodding silently, they followed the doctor into a small consultation room, leaving Finn in the care of Mr. Ambrose. As the door closed behind them, the hospital hallway fell silent once again, the tension palpable in the air. Finn looked up at Mr. Ambrose, fresh tears glistening in his eyes. "What's going on? Why can't they tell us now?" The minutes dragged on like hours as Finn and Mr. Ambrose waited in the hallway. The boy alternated between pacing nervously and sitting, unable to contain his anxiety. Mr. Ambrose watched silently, his face a mask of worry. Finally, the door to the consultation room opened and James and Laurel emerged, their faces a complex mix of emotions. Finn ran to them, his eyes pleading for answers. "Willow, the surgery was successful, Finn." "Willow is alive," Finn began, his voice trembling. James knelt down, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. "Your little sister is going to be okay, my son. She's going to be okay," he said with a sob. A collective sigh of relief filled the hallway. Laurel pulled Finn into a tight hug, tears of joy and exhaustion streaming down her face. James stood up, turning to Mr. Ambrose with a look of deep gratitude. The doctor joined the group, his expression serious but optimistic. "Willow showed incredible strength, but the road ahead will be challenging. She will need intensive care and ongoing treatment. Her condition was very serious, and recovery will be a long process," the doctor explained. James nodded, his voice firm despite the exhaustion. "We will do whatever it takes. The most important thing is that she's going to be all right," he said. The following days passed in a blur of hospital visits, consultations with doctors, and preparations for Willow's continued care. James and Laurel took turns staying at the hospital, ensuring that someone was always by their daughter's side. Finn, though eager to see his sister, could only visit briefly due to the restrictions in the intensive care unit. Mr. Ambrose Sinclair remained a constant presence, offering quiet support and ensuring all medical expenses were covered. "How are we going to pay for all of this, Father?" "The doctor said Willow will need ongoing treatment," Finn asked one night, his voice filled with worry. James exchanged a glance with Laurel before replying. "Mr. Ambrose is helping us, son, and I'm going back to work. I'll find a way to pay for everything." Finally, after a week in intensive care, Willow was moved to a regular room. Though still weak and connected to several monitors, she was awake and alert, bringing a wave of joy and relief to the Thorne family. With Willow stabilized, James knew it was time to fulfill his part of the agreement with Mr. Ambrose. On the morning he was to return to the Sinclair mansion, James kissed Willow on the forehead, hugged Finn and Laurel, and left with a mix of apprehension and determination. As he approached the imposing property, he noticed unusual activity near the back entrance. Curious and slightly apprehensive, he headed in that direction only to stumble upon a surprising scene. Mr. Everett was standing amidst a pile of suitcases and boxes, his face red with anger as he barked orders at a few bewildered employees. When he saw James, his eyes narrowed dangerously, a mixture of fury and contempt evident in every line of his face. "You! This is your fault, isn't it?" Everett snarled, advancing toward James. James took a step back, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Mr. Everett, I don't know what you're talking about. The tense air was suddenly cut by the firm voice of Mr. Ambrose Sinclair. "Everett, that's enough." Everyone turned to see the patriarch of the Sinclair family walking toward them, his presence commanding even in his advanced age. He cast a stern look at his son before turning to James. "Mr. Thorne, please follow me to my office. We have important matters to discuss," he said in a firm voice. James hesitated for a moment, looking from Everett to Ambrose. "Of course, Mr. Sinclair," he replied, following the older man. Everett followed them, muttering under his breath. "This is ridiculous, Father. You can't be serious. There's still time to change your mind. You've made your point, but you can't actually mean this," he said as he trailed behind them. In the large office, decorated with dark wooden furniture and shelves filled with books, Mr. Ambrose took his place behind the imposing oak desk. James remained standing, feeling uncomfortable, while Everett threw himself into a chair, his face a mask of displeasure. Silence hung in the air for a few moments, before Everett finally exploded. "Father, you need to tell him about your absurd decision. Let him know what's happening here. I hope he knows his place and refuses whatever you're proposing, because you're not thinking clearly." "This man is just the gardener," Everett said. Mr. Ambrose sighed deeply, his eyes moving between his son and James. "Yes, son, I will tell him everything, but I am certain of my decision. He is not just a gardener. He is a dignified employee and a loyal worker who has served us for many years." The patriarch stood up slowly, walking over to the window that overlooked the vast gardens of the estate. His gaze wandered over the landscape for a moment before he turned to face the two men. "James, what I am about to tell you may seem surprising, but I ask you to listen until the end." James nodded silently, feeling the tension in the room grow. Mr. Ambrose began to speak, his voice filled with emotion and determination. "Everett, you think I'm being unfair, but the truth is I'm trying to teach you a valuable lesson about humility and the worth of hard work." Mr. Ambrose paused, his eyes focusing on James. "You know, Mr. Thorne, I see a lot of myself in you. Many assume I was born into wealth, but the truth is quite different. My first job was cutting the neighbor's lawn when I was just a teenager. That's how I started, with calloused hands and sweat running down my face under the scorching sun. I learned the value of every penny earned honestly, the satisfaction of a job well done, no matter how humble the task. It was that work ethic that allowed me to build all of this." He gestured broadly, indicating not just the office but the entire estate. "Everett," he continued, turning to his son, "you grew up with privileges I never had at your age. That is why, my son, I have made a difficult but necessary decision. You will lose your position at the company. You will live in a modest house and work in a humble role, starting from the bottom, just as I did all those years ago. This is not a punishment, son. It is an opportunity for growth to rediscover the values I tried to teach you over the years." Turning to James, Mr. Ambrose continued, "And this is where you come in, Mr. Thorne. I will personally take over Everett's role in managing the company. But I don't want to do this alone. I want you by my side, learning the aspects of the business." James blinked, stunned by the turn of events. I don't understand, Mr. Sinclair. I'm just a gardener." Mr. Ambrose smiled kindly. "And I was once just a lawn cutter, but I see something in you that reminds me of myself when I was young. Integrity, determination, and a deep understanding of the value of hard work. Besides, you need to continue paying for your daughter's treatment, and you'll do that by working honestly, as you always have. However, this time, you will have a better opportunity." The patriarch walked back to his desk, sitting down heavily. "This is not just a business decision, James. It is a chance to correct mistakes, to restore the values that built my family. You understand what it means to work hard, the struggles and aspirations. Your perspective will be invaluable as we work to create a more fair and respectful workplace." He paused, his eyes shining with a mix of emotion and determination. "It won't be easy. There will be resistance, doubts, maybe even resentment from some, but I believe that together we can make a difference, not just for my company, but for all the families that depend on it." Mr. Ambrose stood up again, extending his hand to James. "So, Mr. Thorne, what do you say? Are you ready to embark on this journey with me, to help transform not just this company, but also the lives of everyone who works here?" Silence fell over the office as James absorbed everything that had been said. Everett remained in his chair, a mixture of shock and resignation on his face. Mr. Ambrose waited patiently, his hand still extended, his eyes fixed on James with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul. James felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. He thought of Willow still recovering, of Finn and Laurel, and of all the families who depended on the Sinclair Company for their livelihoods. Slowly he extended his hand, firmly shaking Mr. Ambrose's. "I'm ready, Mr. Sinclair. I promise to give it my all," James said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Mr. Ambrose smiled, a glint of approval in his eyes. "That's all I ask, James. That's all I ask." The following months brought significant changes for everyone involved. Everett Sinclair, once the arrogant heir to the family fortune, now faced the harsh reality of manual labor in one of the company's factories. His new boss, a robust and authoritative man, didn't hesitate to assign him the most grueling and thankless tasks. One morning, as Everett struggled to clean a massive industrial tank, Frank watched him with a sardonic smile. "Come on, Sinclair, that tank won't clean itself, or are your soft hands not up to a little real work?" The boss's cutting words echoed in Everett's ears, making him reflect on how he had treated his former subordinates. "I never imagined it would be this hard," Everett murmured to himself, rubbing his sore hands. Frank laughed sarcastically. "Welcome to the real world, kid. No silk cushions here." Meanwhile, at the Sinclair mansion, James Thorne was deeply immersed in his new role. Under the patient guidance of Mr. Ambrose, he quickly absorbed the intricate details of business management. His fresh ideas and unique perspective as a former gardener brought a new dynamic to board meetings. On one particularly productive afternoon, after James presented a plan to improve the working conditions for maintenance and gardening staff, Mr. Ambrose couldn't contain his enthusiasm. "James, you are exceeding all my expectations," Mr. Ambrose said, a genuine smile lighting up his wrinkled face. James nodded humbly. "I'm just applying what I learned while working in the garden, sir. I know how much the maintenance staff deserves better conditions." The most exciting transformation, however, took place at the hospital. After weeks of intensive treatment and recovery, Willow was finally discharged. The day she left the hospital was filled with tears of joy and radiant smiles. James, Laurel, and Finn surrounded little Willow, who, though still a bit pale, radiated surprising strength. Mr. Ambrose made sure to be present, watching the scene with tear-filled eyes. "Father, can I play in the White Lily Garden again now?" Willow asked, her eyes shining with anticipation. James hugged her tightly, his voice choked with emotion. "Of course you can, my love. The garden is waiting for you." Weeks turned into months, and life at the Sinclair mansion and the company took on a new rhythm. James thrived in his new role, implementing changes that benefited the employees and increased productivity. Everett, in turn, slowly began to understand the value of hard work and humility. On a surprise visit to the factory, Mr. Ambrose found his son covered in grease, but with a glimmer of determination in his eyes that he had never seen before. "How's it going, son?" Mr. Ambrose asked, a mix of concern and pride in his voice. Everett wiped the sweat from his forehead, a small smile forming on his lips. "It's tough, Father, but I'm learning a lot. About work, about people, about myself. I see now the countless mistakes I've made." As time passed, the Sinclair mansion and the company underwent a remarkable transformation, not just in structure but in spirit. Mr. Ambrose Sinclair, with the invaluable help of James, implemented changes that resonated throughout the organization. One of Mr. Ambrose's first actions was to track down and rehire all the employees who had been unjustly fired or mistreated by Everett. The former driver was invited back with a promotion to logistics manager. The cook, who had been threatened with dismissal for complaining about unpaid overtime, now supervised the entire food service team with a generous benefits package. The cleaning lady, whom Everett had threatened with deportation, not only got her job back, but also received legal assistance to secure her citizenship in the country. James, in his new executive role, never forgot his roots. He implemented a training and development program for employees at all levels, ensuring that everyone had the opportunity to grow within the company. His experience as a gardener proved invaluable, bringing a unique perspective to management and a deep respect for every employee's work. Everett, for his part, emerged from his experience a changed man. After months of hard work and reflection, he requested a meeting with all the employees he had mistreated in the past. With genuine humility, he apologized individually to each one of them, including James. James, Everett said, his voice filled with emotion, "I was arrogant and cruel to you and your family. I ask for forgiveness not only for my actions, but for who I was. You taught me more than I could have ever imagined." James moved, shook Everett's hand. "The past is behind us. What matters is who we choose to be from now on." At home, the Thorne family's life blossomed. Willow, fully recovered, filled the house with her contagious laughter and boundless energy. Finn, relieved and happy to see his sister healthy, became her protector and best friend. The afternoons in the gardens of their home were now the setting for family picnics and playful games. Laurel, seeing the transformation in her family and their life, often found herself amazed by the turn their lives had taken. "Who would have thought that our greatest trial would lead to this?" she remarked to James one evening. Mr. Ambrose Sinclair, observing the positive impact his decisions had on so many lives, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He saw in James not only an excellent executive, but the son he had always wished Everett could be. And in Everett, he finally saw the man he knew his son could become. In an emotional ceremony, Mr. Ambrose announced his retirement, naming James as his successor. The transition was met with enthusiastic applause from all the employees, a testament to the respect and admiration James had earned. Everett continued to work on improving the changes he had made in his character, and never repeated the mistakes of the past. As the sun set over the Sinclair mansion, lighting up the smiling faces of everyone gathered to celebrate, it was clear that a new era had truly begun. An era built on the foundations of mutual respect, compassion, and the understanding that every person, regardless of their position, has value and dignity. James, with Laurel by his side and his children playing happily in the gardens, looked over at Mr. Ambrose and Everett, who were chatting amicably with the employees. He smiled, feeling a deep gratitude for the journey that had brought them all there. What began as a tragedy had transformed into a new beginning for them all, proving that sometimes from the darkest adversities, the brightest opportunities for redemption and growth can arise. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing exciting stories almost every day. We deeply appreciate having you here with us. Thank you for watching.